Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the next review. I thought, for similar reasons that I gave in the Forest and Folklore Mythology review that I recently uploaded, I thought I would do a somewhat more casual review of a book that I read in. I think it might have been last. I can't quite remember if it was last year or the year before that. It might have been last year actually. Architecture, of Visual History. Again, this really is just it's a way of talking about things that I enjoy, topics that I enjoy. So of course I will start off by saying that this book is rather expensive. It's just the nature of the book. I wouldn't say it's a coffee table book. It's not as large as that. So just to give you an idea, this is the cover. Well, I say it's not technically the cover. This is the cover, unfortunately. Would much rather prefer it was this, but what can you do? So this book doesn't really dwell so much on theory. It's not a textbook on architecture. It's, as the title implies, it's a visual history. It's more of a, it's just, I guess I found it enjoyable for the sort of aesthetic overload of all these different beautiful buildings. And I say that it's not a theoretical book. There is, however, quite a lot of detail on, for example, timelines and key figures and whatnot. But overall, it's really, as we will see eventually, it's more about case studies, small case studies. Each building will be given maybe about 2 or 3 paragraphs, perhaps not even that sometimes. But it's really it's a very, very comprehensive book on architecture. It's a DK publication. It's of course it's a rather hefty production. So just to give you an idea of what we're dealing with here, the book is really, I would say that it's set up into it's a chronological survey of architecture throughout history, but it's also divided into region. It starts in the ancient Near East and in ancient Egypt, from the village to the city. That's what this section is called. It goes on to talk about the Americas, the classical world, of course, India and Southeast Asia. At certain points, it seems to be more focused on region, but then it will pick up again in terms of chronology. So, for example, we'll have medieval Europe, the Renaissance, the Baroque period, the Rococo as well, classical revival, the industrial world, and then, of course, the modern world, contemporary architecture. I'm not quite sure how to encapsulate this, but I just love being presented with all these different styles and motifs, specifically regarding the ancient past and the classical world and whatnot. So, for example, what I love about this book is that it gives a broad overview of a particular architectural style or time period, and then it will give the elements and the motifs and different building processes. So, for example, starting with the ancient Near East, we have a broad overview, and then we have the elements that are iconic to this given sort of architectural style or time period or region. And then it goes on to describe individual buildings, individual case studies. So, Nineveh, the Temple of Solomon, the Tomb of Darius I, the palace complex of Persepolis, things like this. So you'll only get about 2 or 3 paragraphs for each case study, but considering this book is covering all of architecture from the very beginnings, in ancient Near East to the modern world, it's quite impressive. There are also, for the more iconic and popular, I guess, works of architecture, there are sort of full page spreads. I guess that's how you describe it. So again, this isn't so much an academic and theoretical work. It is more of a visual history. You will, however, get examples of famous figures. So, for example, in the classical world, we'll have Pericles and we'll have Alexander the Great. And of course, you can't take away art from architecture. So there are, of course, cultural examples. We have, just turning the page here, we have Raphael's The School of Athens. So what I like about the book is that it's not just architecture, it's also painting, it's also politics as well, history. So of course, as we go through the book, there are wonderful examples from all across the world: China, Japan and Korea, Islamic architecture as well, particularly beautiful regarding calligraphy, geometric designs and whatnot. However, of course, and especially regarding Gothic architecture as well, particular favourite of mine. But as we go through, of course, passing the Italian Renaissance, Baroque period, Rococo, even past, of course, Neoclassicism, we end up in the industrial period and we start seeing changes, don't we? I unfortunately am not a fan of modern architecture. I'll say that. You might have already guessed from the types of themes and aesthetics I'm interested in, sorts of topics I'm interested in. Saying that, I read this book back to back. I think I've mentioned before in previous videos that I'm not quite sure why, but I seem to read books cover to cover, even if they're not necessarily books that need to be read cover to cover. I think it's, I feel if I don't read a book cover to cover, read every page, it seems odd to have it on my shelf because I've not fully read it, but I'm trying not to get into that mindset nowadays. It was a strange thing. I think I was actually reading it almost to try and see the other side and to try and get an idea of why people think that these sorts of architectures are necessary and even beautiful in some respects. So on page 372 we enter into contemporary architecture. Yes, Le Corbusier, Farnsworth House. Have a look at some of these on Google Images. Pirelli Tower, the Air Force Academy, Colorado Springs, the Seagram Building, the Guggenheim Museum, the National Theatre in London, the Pompidou Centre. I believe an example of structural expressionism there. So yes, although the book does of course cover, as it necessarily should cover, contemporary modern architecture, I still highly recommend the book. I think you can't necessarily exclude or separate the bad from the good. I think it's necessary to show why the older styles are important and valuable. The styles that favour form over function. So I do recommend the book. Again, it is quite expensive, but it's a very comprehensive read. It's also just a pleasure to open and just to look through different examples. There's hundreds upon hundreds of examples of architectures here. So I think the reason I chose this book to review, even though I read it early last year, is pertinent because not only am I thinking about architecture from a sort of literary perspective for my potential MA that I'm hopefully going to be doing come September. An article of mine called "You Can't Fly to Space in a Corinthian Column" was recently published by Sci-Fi Journal. That's sci-fi with a PHI, not FI. That essay, that's really an argument for why we should retain the natural and the mythic and the archetypal in architecture. It's really it's an illustration of the fact that sci-fi seems to have wedded itself to the inhuman aesthetic of modernism, sort of the sleek, the unadorned, the mechanical. And I'm really just advocating for retaining, not only in science fiction, but in the world itself, in this world, the retaining of elements that focus on the natural world, on the human form. Because of course, in the past, we only knew the natural world. We weren't slaves to technology. We weren't slaves to the idea of progress and forward movement and power and efficiency. The world was essentially, everywhere you looked there was. Of course, there were utilitarian buildings necessary for a purpose, but there was more of an emphasis on, I think it's fair to say there was more of an emphasis on beauty and form. And it doesn't have to necessarily even be beautiful. It can be striking and terrible. For example, I give the example of gargoyles. The medieval architects of the medieval cathedrals could have used just a regular sort of water spout, but instead they chose to carve gargoyles in grotesque in the general sense. So I'm really an advocate for not only bringing back beautiful and stirring and heroic and weighty sort of imagery into the world, but also darker styles and elements as well. I think I can say that I can envisage a world, or I would appreciate a world where, for example, just thinking of, I think it's St. Bartholomew Flayed, and I think it's in the Duomo, I think. Have a Google image, St. Bartholomew Flayed, the statue. If more statues were like this around the world, I think not only would people be exposed to skill in art generally, but also um, ideas of death and mortality, vanitas images. Um, I I am not a fan of sterility. I'm not a fan of sort of sleek, the unadorned, as I said before, especially not the mechanical. Things like the Pompidou Centre, I gave the example of the Pompidou Centre before. In that style of architecture, it is purely, it's extremely inhuman. There's no sense of nature, there's no sense of beauty, it's purely mechanical. The actual construction is laid bare. It's I can't see why that is a beautiful thing. I can't see why that's a worthwhile thing to have in the world. Of course, there's a lot more nuanced and subtle than this. I try to give the other side the benefit of the doubt as well. I even go so far as to say that postmodern architecture isn't intrinsically worse than older architectures. So I think I'll leave it there. I may cover this topic of architecture in a more, either a vlog or one of my more topic orientated videos. So hopefully you enjoyed the review. Till next time, thanks for watching.